The Avebury revelation when Victorian photography unveiled ancient secrets. 180. Margaret Whitmore carefully lifted another box from the towering stack that had arrived that morning. It was October 15, 1987, and she had been tasked with cataloging the recently acquired collection of Victorian photographer William Hartwell, whose estate had been donated to the Institute following his death the previous month. Whitmore, one of the few women to have earned recognition in the male-dominated field of archaeology, approached each box with the methodical precision that had earned her respect among her peers. At 34, she had already made significant contributions to the understanding of British prehistoric sites, though her work was often overshadowed by her male colleagues' more publicized discoveries. Another box of landscape photographs, I suspect, muttered Professor Edmund Blackwood, the Institute's director, as he passed by her workspace. Hartwell was known for his romantic views of the countryside. Pretty pictures, but hardly of scientific value. Margaret nodded politely but continued her work with undiminished enthusiasm. She had learned long ago that dismissive attitudes often blinded people to important discoveries. As she carefully removed each photograph from its protective wrapping, she found herself increasingly impressed by Hartwell's technical skill and artistic eye. The collection contained hundreds of images documented. There were pastoral scenes of rolling hills, ancient churches nestled in valleys, and weathered stone bridges spanning babbling brooks. But it was when she reached the bottom of the third box that Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The photograph was larger than the others, mounted on thick cardboard with Hartwell's distinctive signature in the corner. The image showed the ancient stone circle at Avebury, in Wiltshire, captured during what appeared to be the golden hour of late afternoon. The massive sarres, in stones, stood like silent sentinels against a dramatic sky, their weathered surfaces rendered in exquisite detail by Hartwell's masterful use of light and shadow. But there was something else in the photograph that made Margaret lean closer, her heart beginning to race with excitement. Among the stones, barely visible in the original print, were what appeared to be human figures. Not modern visitors to the site, but something far more intriguing. Margaret reached for her magnifying glass, a tool she had inherited from her mentor, the late Professor Aldrich. As she focused the lens on the mysterious figures, her excitement grew. The shapes were definitely human, but their clothing and posture suggested they were not contemporary with Hartwell's Yetiot's photography session. "Professor Blackwood," she called out, her voice barely containing her excitement. "I believe you should see this." Blackwood approached with the weary expression of a man who had been interrupted from more pressing matters. "What is it, Dr. Whitmore?" "Another pretty landscape." Margaret handed him the magnifying glass and pointed to the area of the photograph that had captured her attention. "Look carefully at the space between the two largest stones on the eastern side of the circle." Blackwood peered through the glass, his expression gradually changing from mild irritation to intense concentration. After several long moments, he straightened up, his face pale with astonishment. "Good Lord," he whispered. Are those figures in superior costume? That's what I believe we're seeing." Margaret replied, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "But the question is, how did figures in what appears to be medieval or even earlier dress end up in a photograph taken in Europe?" The implications of the discovery sent a chill through both archaeologists. Photography, still a relatively new technology, was considered an objective recorder of reality. The idea that a camera could capture something that wasn't actually present at the moment of exposure challenged everything they understood about both the medium and the nature of historical documentation. Professor Blackwood carefully examined the photograph again, this time paying attention to every detail. The figures appeared to be engaged in some sort of ritual or ceremony, their poses suggesting movement and purpose. Most remarkably, they seemed to be interacting with the stones themselves, as if the ancient circle was not merely a relic, but an active site of ongoing significance. "We need to examine this more thoroughly," Blackwood declared, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by scientific fervor. "You want every detail of this photograph analyzed. Contact Professor Hardwell's assistant to what was his name. Timothy Ashford," Margaret supplied. "He worked with Hardwell for over a decade and was present for many of his photographic expeditions." "Excellent. Arrange a meeting with Mr. Ashford immediately. We need to understand exactly when and how this photograph was taken." And Margaret, a pause, using her first name for the first time in their professional relationship, "Not a word of this to anyone outside the Institute until we understand what we're dealing with." As evening fell over London, Margaret remained at her desk, studying the photograph under various lighting conditions and magnifications. Each examination revealed new details that deepened the mystery. The figures appeared to be wearing robes or cloaks, and some seemed to be carrying objects that might have been ceremonial implements. Most intriguingly, the stones themselves appeared different in the photograph than in contemporary descriptions of the site. Several stones that were known to have been removed or destroyed in previous centuries seemed to be present and intact in Hardwell's image. Margaret made careful notes of her observations, documenting every detail with the precision that had made her reputation. She sketched the positions of the mysterious figures and noted their apparent relationship to specific stones in the circle. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was documenting something that would fundamentally change their understanding of both ancient Britain and the nature of historical evidence itself. The photograph seemed to suggest that Avebury was more than just an archaeological site. It was a place where the boundaries between past and present might be more fluid than anyone had previously imagined. What Whitmore discovered in that Victorian photograph would challenge everything historians thought they knew about ancient Britain. The mysterious figures she found hidden in the image were just the beginning of a revelation that would shake the archaeological world. Continue reading to uncover the shocking truth about what William Hartwell's camera captured that day in Benderchent. Timothy Ashford arrived at the Royal Archaeological Institute the following morning, his weathered hands clutching a leather satchel that had clearly seen many years of use. At 62, he had spent the better part of his adult life as William Hartwell's assistant, traveling throughout England to document the country's ancient monuments and landscapes. Margaret and Professor Blackwood received him in the Institute's private study, a room lined with ancient artifacts and scholarly texts. The mysterious photograph lay on the mahogany table between them, covered by a cloth to preserve the dramatic impact of its revelation. "Miss Ashford," Professor Blackwood began, "we appreciate you coming on such short notice. We have some questions about one of Mr. Hartwell's photographs that we hope you can help us understand." Timothy nodded, his pale blue eyes showing both curiosity and a hint of apprehension. "I'll do my best, Professor. William and I worked together for 15 years, and I was present for most of his important photographic sessions." Margaret carefully removed the cloth covering the Avebury photograph. "Do you remember when this image was taken?" Timothy's reaction was immediate and startling. His face went completely white, and his hands began to tremble slightly. He stared at the photograph for a long moment before speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "I remember that day very well," he said finally. "It was September 21st, 1984, the autumn equinox. William had been planning that particular shoot for months. What made that day special?" Margaret asked gently, sensing that Timothy was struggling with some internal conflict. Timothy was quiet for several minutes, his eyes never leaving the photograph. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a secret long held. "William wasn't just a photographer," he began slowly. "He was also a student of what he called temporal phenomena. He believed that certain ancient sites, particularly stone circles, were what he termed windows in time, places where the past and present could occasionally intersect." Professor Blackwood leaned forward, his skepticism evident. "Are you suggesting that Mr. Hartwell believed in some sort of supernatural occurrence?" Not supernatural, Timothy replied firmly. William was a man of science. He believed that these phenomena had natural explanations that we simply didn't yet understand. He spent the years studying the astronomical alignments of sentient sites, the geological properties of the stones, and the historical accounts of unusual experiences at these locations. Margaret studied Timothy's face carefully. And what did he discover? Timothy reached into his leather satchel and withdrew a worn notebook bound in dark leather. William kept detailed records of his observation. He documented patterns in when these temporal windows might open, always on significant astronomical dates, always under specific atmospheric conditions. He opened the notebook to a page marked with a red ribbon. September 21st, 1984, was a perfect convergence. The autumn equinox, a particular alignment of the stones with the setting sun, and atmospheric conditions that William had learned to recognize as favorable for these phenomena. You're saying that Mr. Hartwell deliberately went to Avebury expecting to photograph something unusual? Margaret asked. More than that, Timothy replied. He had developed techniques for capturing these temporal intersections, special photographic plates, specific exposure times, particular positioning of his camera. That photograph you're looking at represents the culmination of years of research and experimentation. Professor Blackwood remained skeptical. Even if we accept your account, how do we explain what appears to be medieval figures in a Victorian photograph? Timothy turned several pages in the notebook and pointed to a detailed diagram. William believed that Avebury had been a site of continuous ritual activity for thousands of years. He theorized that during certain conditions, the camera could capture what he called temporal echoes, images of past events that somehow lingered at the site. Margaret examined the diagram, which showed the stone circle with various astronomical alignments marked. According to this, the figures in the photograph would be positioned precisely along the sight lines for the equinox sunset. Exactly, Timothy confirmed. William believed that the ancient builders of Avebury understood something about the nature of time and space that we've forgotten. The stone circle wasn't just a monument, it was a kind of temporal instrument. The room fell silent as the implications of Timothy's account sank in. If his story was true, the photograph represented evidence of a phenomenon that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of time and historical documentation. There's more, Timothy continued, his voice growing stronger as he shared the secret he had carried for 3 years. This wasn't the only photograph of its kind that William captured. Over the years, he documented similar phenomena at Stonehenge, the Ring of Brodgar in Scotland, and several other ancient sites. He reached into his satchel again and withdrew a small collection of photographs. Each showed an ancient stone circle, and each contained figures that appeared to be from different historical periods than when the photograph was taken. William was preparing to present his findings to the Royal Society when he died. Timothy explained. He believed he had discovered evidence of what he called chronological archaeology, the ability to observe and document past events through photographic techniques. Margaret carefully examined each photograph, her excitement growing with each image. These figures, they're all positioned in astronomically significant locations within the circles. William's theory was that certain individuals throughout history had understood the temporal properties of these sites. Timothy said, Druids, medieval monks, even some Victorian occultists. They know when and how to position themselves to interact with these temporal windows. Professor Blackwood, despite his initial skepticism, was beginning to grasp the revolutionary implications of what they were discussing. If this is genuine, it would represent the most significant archaeological discovery of our time. We would have direct photographic evidence of ancient rituals and practices. But it would also raise profound questions about the nature of time itself, Margaret added. If the past can somehow be photographed in the present, what does that mean for our understanding of history and causality? Timothy nodded, gravely. William wrestled with those same questions. He died before he could find answers, but he was convinced that these photographs represented only the beginning of what might be possible. As the meeting concluded, Margaret found herself holding not just a mysterious photograph, but the key to a completely new field of historical investigation. The implications were staggering, but so were the challenges of proving the authenticity and significance of what they had discovered. Timothy Ashford's revelations opened up possibilities that seemed to defy the laws of physics themselves. But the most shocking discoveries were yet to come. As Dr. Whitmore delved deeper into William Hartwell's research, she would uncover evidence that would force her to question everything she thought she knew about the ancient world. Keep reading to discover what other secrets lay hidden in those Victorian photographs. Margaret Whitmore barely slept at night, her mind racing with the implications of Timothy Ashford's revelations. By dawn, she had formulated a comprehensive plan for investigating the authenticity and significance of Hartwell's photographs. If these images were genuine, they represented evidence of phenomena that could revolutionize both archaeology and physics. She arrived at the Institute early, finding Professor Blackwood already in his office, surrounded by books on optics, photography, and temporal physics. The normally composed director looked as though he had spent the night wrestling with the same questions that had kept Margaret awake. "I've been thinking about our next steps," Margaret began, settling into the chair across from his desk. "We need to approach this investigation with absolute scientific rigor. The claims are so extraordinary that our evidence must be beyond reproach." Blackwood nodded, removing his spectacles to clean them nervously. "I've contacted Professor James Maxwell at Cambridge. He's one of the foremost experts on electromagnetic theory and might be able to provide insight into the physical mechanisms that could explain these phenomena." "Excellent," Margaret replied. "I've also arranged for a consultation with Dr. Henry Fox Talbot's former assistant. If anyone can authenticate the photographic techniques and determine whether these images could have been artificially created, it would be someone with his expertise." Over the following days, the Institute became a hub of intense scientific activity. Margaret had arranged for the photographs to be examined using every available analytical technique. Microscopic examination of the photographic plates revealed no evidence of double exposure or artificial manipulation. The grain structure and chemical composition of the images were consistent throughout, suggesting that the mysterious figures had been present at the moment of exposure. Charles Pemberton, the photographic expert, spent hours examining Hartwell's equipment, which Timothy had brought from the photographer's estate. The camera, lenses, and photographic plates were all standard for the period, with no modifications that might explain the unusual results. From a technical standpoint, Dr. Pemberton reported, "These photographs appear to be completely authentic. The exposure times, depth of field, and lighting conditions are all consistent with normal outdoor photography. If these images were artificially created, it would have required techniques that simply didn't exist in the Ethiopian." In a detailed letter, he outlined several emerging theories about the nature of time and electromagnetic radiation that might provide a framework for understanding Hartwell's discoveries. Recent work in electromagnetic theory suggests that certain materials, particularly crystalline structures like those found in sarsen stones, might be capable of storing and releasing electromagnetic information under specific conditions, Maxwell wrote. "While the mechanism remains unclear, it's theoretically possible that these stones could function as a kind of temporal recording device." Margaret found herself diving deeper into Hartwell's research notes, which Timothy had agreed to share with the Institute. The photographer's journals revealed a methodical approach to his investigations that impressed her with its scientific rigor. Hartwell had documented metamorphic conditions, astronomical alignments, geological surveys of the stone circles, and detailed accounts of local folklore and historical records. He had identified patterns in when the temporal phenomena occur and had developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for capturing them photographically. One entry, dated March 15th, y 1983 particularly caught Margaret's attention. The key appears to be the interaction between the astronomical alignment, the electromagnetic properties of the stones, and what I can only describe as a form of atmospheric resonance. The ancient builders understood something about these interactions that we are only beginning to rediscover. They positioned the stones not just as monuments, but as instruments for manipulating temporal boundaries. Margaret shared this entry with Professor Blackwood, who had been conducting his own investigation into the historical records of unusual phenomena at ancient sites. His research had uncovered numerous accounts throughout history of strange experiences at stone circles, sightings of figures in anachronistic clothing, sounds of ancient ceremonies, and even reports of people temporarily disappearing only to return with accounts of witnessing past events. What's remarkable, Blackwood observed, is how consistent these accounts are across different time periods and locations. Medieval chroniclers, Renaissance scholars, and even contemporary visitors to these sites have reported similar phenomena. The breakthrough in their investigation came when Margaret decided to examine the Avebury photograph under different types of light. Using a technique she had learned during her studies of ancient manuscripts, she illuminated the image with various wavelengths to reveal details invisible under normal lighting. Under ultraviolet light, additional figures became visible in the photograph, figures that were completely invisible under normal illumination. Various ghostly forms appeared to be engaged in the same ritual activities as the more clearly visible figures, but they seemed to represent different time periods based on their clothing and posture. It's as if the photograph captured multiple temporal layers simultaneously, Margaret explained to an astonished Professor Blackwood. We're not just seeing one moment in time, but several moments layered on top of each other. This discovery led to a systematic examination of all of Hartwell's photographs using the same technique. Each image revealed additional temporal layers, creating a complex palimpsest of historical activity at these ancient sites. The implications were staggering. If Hartwell's photographs were authentic, they provided direct visual evidence of continuous ritual activity at these sites, spanning thousands of years. They suggested that the ancient stone circles were not merely monuments to the dead past, but active sites where the boundaries between different time periods remained permeable. Dr. Pemberton's technical analysis supported this interpretation. The layering of images appears to be a natural phenomenon related to the photographic process itself, he reported. Under certain electromagnetic conditions, photographic plates might be capable of capturing multiple temporal impressions simultaneously. As word of their investigation began to spread within the scientific community, Margaret found herself at the center of a growing controversy. Traditional archaeologists dismissed the photographs as elaborate hoaxes, while physicists debated the theoretical possibilities of temporal photography. The debate intensified when Professor Maxwell arrived in London to examine the evidence personally. His reputation as one of the foremost scientific minds of the age lent credibility to the investigation, but also increased the scrutiny from skeptics. The evidence is compelling, Maxwell declared, after spending a week examining the photographs and Hartwell's equipment. While I cannot fully explain the mechanism involved, the consistency and technical authenticity of these images suggest that we are dealing with a genuine phenomenon that challenges our current understanding of time and electromagnetic radiation. Margaret realized that they had reached a crucial juncture in their investigation. The scientific evidence supported the authenticity of Hartwell's photographs, but the implications were so revolutionary that they needed additional proof before presenting their findings to the wider scientific community. The scientific investigation was yielding results that seemed to confirm the impossible, that Victorian photography had somehow captured images from across the centuries. But Dr. Whitmore knew that the most crucial test still lay ahead. She would need to return to Avebury itself to attempt to recreate Hartwell's extraordinary achievement. What she discovered there would either validate their findings or expose them as elaborate illusions. Continue reading to witness the moment when science confronted the impossible. The morning of September 31st, de 1887, Dawned crisp and clear as Dr. Margaret Whitmore stood at the edge of the ancient stone circle at Avebury. Exactly 3 years had passed since William Hartwell had captured his extraordinary photograph, and Margaret had chosen this date deliberately, hoping to recreate the conditions that had made his temporal photography possible. She was not alone in this endeavor. Professor Blackwood had accompanied her, along with Dr. Pemberton and his photographic equipment. Timothy Ashford, with his intimate knowledge of Hartwell's techniques, and Professor Maxwell, whose theoretical insights had provided the scientific framework for understanding what they hoped to achieve. The team had arrived in Wiltshire 2 days earlier, spending time studying the site and preparing their equipment according to Hartwell's detailed notes. Margaret had walked the circle countless times, familiarizing herself with every stone, every alignment, every subtle variation in the landscape that might influence their experiment. The atmospheric conditions are nearly identical to those recorded in Hartwell's journal, Professor Maxwell observed, consulting his instruments. Barometric pressure, humidity, and electromagnetic readings all fall within the parameters he identified as optimal. Timothy Ashford was setting up the camera in the exact position that Hartwell had used 3 years earlier. The elderly assistant moved with practiced precision, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. William always said that the positioning was crucial, Timothy explained, as he adjusted the tripod. Not just the angle and distance, but the precise relationship to the astronomical alignments. The camera must be positioned so that it captures the intersection of the earthly and celestial geometries. Margaret consulted Hartwell's astronomical chalchols, which indicated that the optimal moment would occur at 3:47 p.m. when the autumn sun would align perfectly with specific stones in the circle. They had less than an hour to complete their preparations. Pemberton was preparing the photographic plates using the special chemical treatments that Hartwell had developed. These modifications, detailed in the photographer's private notes, involved exposing the plates to specific electromagnetic frequencies before use. Hartwell believed that these treatments made the plates more sensitive to what he called temporal radiation. Dr. Pemberton explained as he worked in the portable darkroom they had constructed. The science behind it is unclear, but the chemical analysis suggests that these treatments do alter the molecular structure of the photographic emulsion. As the appointed time approached, Margaret felt a growing sense of anticipation mixed with apprehension. If their experiment succeeded, it would validate Hartwell's discoveries and open up entirely new fields of scientific investigation. If it failed, they might be forced to conclude that the original photographs were somehow fraudulent, despite all evidence to the contrary. Professor Blackwood was documenting every aspect of their procedure, creating a detailed record that would allow other scientists to replicate their experiment. "Whatever happens today," he said, "we must ensure that our methodology is beyond reproach. The scientific community will scrutinize every detail of our work." At 3:30 p.m., Timothy began the exposure sequence that Hartwell had perfected. Unlike conventional photography, which required exposures of seconds or minutes, Hartwell's temporal photography involved a complex series of exposures timed to coincide with specific astronomical moments. The first exposure captures the present moment, Timothy explained as he removed the lens cap. But as the sun moves into perfect alignment with the stones, subsequent exposures may capture temporal echoes from the past. Margaret watched the proceedings with intense concentration, noting every detail of the process. The autumn sun was casting long shadows across the ancient stones, creating the same dramatic lighting conditions that were visible in Hartwell's original photograph. As 3:47 p.m. approached, something extraordinary began to happen. The air within the stone circle seemed to shimmer slightly, as if heat waves were rising from the ground, despite the cool autumn temperature. Professor Maxwell's electromagnetic instruments began registering unusual readings. "The electromagnetic field is fluctuating in a pattern I've never seen before," Maxwell reported, his voice tight with excitement. "It's as if the stones themselves are generating some form of energy." Timothy continued the exposure sequence, his movements precise and deliberate. Margaret found herself holding her breath as the critical moment approached. The sun was now perfectly aligned with the eastern stones of the circle, casting a beam of light that seemed to illuminate the very heart of the ancient monument. At exactly 3:47 p.m., something remarkable occurred. For just a moment, Margaret could have sworn she saw figures moving among the stones. Translucent, ghostly forms that seemed to be engaged in some sort of ritual activity. The vision lasted only seconds, but it was witnessed by all 5 members of the expedition. "Did you all see that?" Professor Blackwood whispered, his voice filled with awe. "The figures," Margaret replied, her heart pounding. "They were exactly as they appeared in Hartwell's photograph." Timothy completed the final exposure and carefully replaced the lens cap. "Now we wait," he said simply. "The developing process will reveal whether we've captured anything unusual." The team returned to their temporary laboratory in the nearby village of Avebury, where Dr. Pemberton began the delicate process of developing the photographic plates. The entire group waited in tense silence as the images slowly emerged in the chemical baths. The first plate showed the stone circle exactly as it appeared to the naked eye, an impressive but conventional photograph of the ancient monument. But as Dr. Pemberton moved to the second plate, which had been exposed during the critical alignment moment, gasps of amazement filled the room. The photograph clearly showed the same mysterious figures that had appeared in Hartwell's original image. But more than that, it showed additional figures, positioned in different parts of the circle, engaged in what appeared to be a complex ceremonial activity. "Remarkable," Professor Maxwell breathed, studying the image through a magnifying glass. The figures appeared to be interacting not just with the stones, but with each other across what must be vast spans of time. Margaret examined the photograph with growing excitement. The new image provided additional details about the mysterious ritual that had been partially captured in Hartwell's original photograph. She could see that the figures were arranged in specific patterns that corresponded to astronomical alignments, and that they appeared to be using implements that suggested sophisticated understanding of the site's properties. "This validates everything," Professor Blackwood declared. "We have successfully replicated Hartwell's temporal photography under controlled scientific conditions. This is no longer a matter of speculation. We have documented proof of these phenomena." But even as the team celebrated their success, Margaret realized that their achievement raised as many questions as it answered. If they could photograph past events at ancient sites, what did this mean for the nature of time itself? Were these glimpses of the past somehow still present at these locations, waiting to be observed under the right conditions? The implications extended far beyond archaeology. If the past could be photographed, might it also be possible to interact with it in other ways? Were these ancient sites somehow preserving not just images, but actual temporal connections to previous eras? As evening fell over Avebury, Margaret stood once again among the ancient stones, contemplating the magnitude of what they had discovered. The stone circle, which had stood for thousands of years as a monument to a forgotten past, had revealed itself to be something far more extraordinary. A window through time itself. The successful recreation of Hartwell's temporal photography proved that the impossible was indeed possible. But this breakthrough was only the beginning. As Dr. Whitmore and her team prepared to share their discoveries with the world, they had no idea that their findings would unlock secrets that had been hidden for millennia. The ancient builders of Avebury had left behind more than just stones. They had created a technology that challenged everything science thought it knew about reality itself. Continue reading to discover the earth-shattering revelations that would emerge from their investigation. The weeks following their successful experiment at Avebury were filled with intense analysis and growing amazement, as Dr. Margaret Whitmore and her team began to understand the true scope of what they had discovered. The photographic evidence they had gathered suggested that the ancient stone circles were not merely monuments, but sophisticated technological devices whose purpose and capabilities had been lost to history. Margaret had established a dedicated laboratory at the Royal Archaeological Institute, where she worked alongside Professor Maxwell to analyze the electromagnetic properties of the stones themselves. Using samples that had been collected from various stone circles with the permission of local authorities, they began to uncover the scientific principles that made temporal photography possible. The Saracen stones contain a unique crystalline structure, Professor Maxwell explained during one of their research sessions. When subjected to specific electromagnetic frequencies, particularly those generated by astronomical alignments, these crystals appear to function as a form of temporal recording device. The implications were staggering. If Maxwell's analysis was correct, the ancient builders of these monuments had possessed knowledge of electromagnetic theory and temporal physics that wouldn't be rediscovered by modern science for thousands of years. Margaret had been corresponding with scholars across Europe, sharing their findings and seeking additional evidence of similar phenomena. The response had been mixed. While some researchers expressed fascination with their discoveries, others dismissed their work as elaborate fraud or delusion. However, support came from an unexpected source when Dr. Heinrich Schliemann, the famous archaeologist who had discovered Troy, wrote from Germany expressing his belief in their findings. Schliemann had encountered similar phenomena during his excavations and had long suspected that ancient civilizations possessed technological capabilities that modern scholarship had underestimated. I have witnessed things at Troy that conventional archaeology cannot explain, Schliemann wrote. Your discoveries at Avebury may provide the key to understanding technologies that we have dismissed as mythology. Encouraged by this support, Margaret decided to expand their investigation to include other ancient sites across Britain. If Avebury and the other stone circles were indeed technological devices, there might be additional sites that exhibited similar properties. Their first expedition took them to Stonehenge, where they attempted to replicate their temporal photography techniques. The results were even more dramatic than at Avebury. The photographs captured at Stonehenge revealed not just individual figures, but entire processions of people from different historical periods, all apparently engaged in astronomical observations and ritual activities. It's as if Stonehenge served as a kind of temporal observatory, Margaret observed as she studied the new photograph. People throughout history have been drawn to this site to observe and record celestial events, and somehow their activities have been preserved in the electromagnetic structure of the stones. The most remarkable discovery came when they examined the photographs under different types of light. Using techniques developed during their analysis of the Avebury images, they found that each wavelength revealed different temporal layers, creating a complex chronological record of human activity at the site. We're looking at thousands of years of human history preserved in stone. Professor Blackwood marveled, these monuments aren't just archaeological sites, they're libraries of temporal information. Timothy Ashford, who had become an integral member of their research team, made a crucial observation during their analysis of the Stonehenge photographs. Look at the positioning of the figures across different time periods, he said, pointing to specific locations in the images. They're all observing the same astronomical phenomena: the summer solstice, sunrise; the winter solstice, sunset; specific lunar alignments. This observation led Margaret to a startling realization. The ancient builders hadn't just created monuments that could record temporal information. They had designed them to attract and focus human attention on specific astronomical events across the century. They knew that future generations would be drawn to these sites, she explained to Professor Maxwell. The monuments were designed to create a kind of temporal continuity, ensuring that astronomical knowledge would be preserved and transmitted across thousands of years. The team's research took on new urgency when they discovered that the temporal recording properties of the stones were not unlimited. Analysis of their electromagnetic readings suggested that the stone's capacity to store temporal information was gradually diminishing, possibly due to environmental factors or the natural decay of their crystalline structure. We may be witnessing the final phase of a technology that has been operating for millennia. Professor Maxwell warned, if we don't document this phenomena soon, they may be lost forever. This realization prompted Margaret to organize a comprehensive survey of stone circles across Britain and Ireland. Working with local archaeological societies and university departments, they began a systematic program of temporal photography at dozens of ancient sites. The results exceeded their wildest expectations. Nearly every stone circle they investigated showed evidence of temporal recording, though the clarity and extent of the phenomena varied significantly between sites. Some circles revealed only faint traces of past activity, while others, particularly those with specific astronomical elements, contained rich layers of temporal information. The most significant discovery came at the Ring of Brodgar, in Scotland, where their photographs revealed what appeared to be the original construction of the monument. The images showed ancient builders positioning the stones with incredible precision, using techniques and tools that suggested far more sophisticated engineering capabilities than conventional archaeology had attributed to Neolithic peoples. These people weren't primitive Stone Age farmers, Margaret declared, as she studied the construction images. They were sophisticated engineers and astronomers who understood principles of physics that we're only beginning to rediscover. The evidence was mounting that the conventional understanding of prehistoric Britain was fundamentally flawed. The stone circles represented not the crude monuments of primitive peoples, but the remnants of an advanced civilization that had possessed technological capabilities that seemed almost magical by modern standards. Professor Maxwell's theoretical work provided a framework for understanding how such technology might have functioned. The ancient builders appeared to have understood that certain materials, when arranged in specific geometric patterns and aligned with astronomical phenomena, could manipulate electromagnetic fields in ways that affect the flow of time itself, he explained. They created what we might call temporal engines, devices that could capture, store, and replay information across vast spans of time. The stone circles weren't just monuments to the dead. They were active technologies designed to preserve knowledge for future generations. As their research progressed, Margaret began to realize that they had uncovered evidence of a lost chapter in human history. The ancient builders of the stone circles had possessed knowledge and capabilities that challenged everything modern science thought it knew about the development of human civilization. But their discoveries also raised profound questions about the nature of time, consciousness, and reality itself. If the past could be photographed and observed, what did this mean for concepts of causality and free will? Were these glimpses of history somehow still active and present? Or were they merely recordings preserved in stone? The revelation that ancient peoples possessed advanced temporal technology was just the beginning of a discovery that would reshape human understanding of history itself. But as Dr. Whitmore delved into the mysteries of the stone circles, she would uncover evidence of something even more extraordinary, a message from the past that had been waiting thousands of years to be decoded. The final chapter of this incredible story reveals secrets that would change everything we thought we knew about our ancestors and our place in the cosmos. By the spring of 1888, Dr. Margaret Whitmore had accumulated what amounted to a photographic archive of British prehistory. A collection of temporal photographs from dozens of stone circles across the British Isles revealed patterns of activity spanning thousands of years, but it was the discovery of systematic arrangements in these patterns that led to her most extraordinary breakthrough. Working late one evening in her laboratory at the Royal Archaeological Institute, Margaret was comparing photographs from different sites when she noticed something that made her heart race with excitement. The positioning of figures across different stone circles in different time periods wasn't random. It followed a deliberate pattern that suggested some form of communication or record-keeping system. "Professor Blackwood," she called out, though it was well past normal working hours. "You need to see this immediately." Blackwood, who had been working in his adjacent office, hurried to Margaret's laboratory. She had spread dozens of photographs across several tables with lines drawn connecting similar positions and arrangements of figures. "Look at the patterns," Margaret said, her voice trembling with excitement. The figures aren't just engaged in random ritual activity. They're positioned in specific arrangements that correspond to astronomical configurations. And these arrangements are consistent across different sites and different time periods. Blackwood studied the photographs carefully, following the lines Margaret had drawn. Gradually, his expression changed from confusion to amazement as he began to see the pattern she had identified. "It's a form of notation," he breathed. They were using the stone circles as a kind of three-dimensional writing system, recording astronomical observations and other information by positioning people in specific arrangements. Margaret nodded enthusiastically. "But it's more than just notation. Look at this sequence from Avebury." She pointed to a series of photographs, showed the same ritual arrangement repeated across what appeared to be several different time periods. They weren't just recording information, they were transmitting it across time. The implications were staggering. If Margaret's interpretation was correct, the ancient builders had created a communication system that could preserve and transmit information across millennia. The stone circles weren't just monuments or even temporal recording devices. They were components of a vast information storage and transmission network. Professor Maxwell, who had been summoned to examine Margaret's discovery, provided the theoretical framework that made sense of what they were observing. The positioning of human figures within the electromagnetic fields generated by the stone circles could indeed function as a form of information encoding, he explained. The specific arrangements would create unique electromagnetic signatures that could be preserved and later decoded. Working with Maxwell's theoretical insights, Margaret began the painstaking process of decoding the information preserved in their temporal photographs. She developed a system for cataloging the different arrangements of figures and correlating them with astronomical events and other observable phenomena. The breakthrough came when she realized that the most complex arrangements appeared during significant astronomical events and eclipses, planetary alignments, and rare celestial phenomena that occurred only once in several generations. These events seemed to trigger the most elaborate information encoding activities. They were using rare astronomical events as opportunities to transmit the most important information, Margaret explained to her colleague. The rarer the event, the more significant the message they were trying to preserve. The most significant discovery came when Margaret analyzed the photographs taken during a lunar eclipse. The temporal photographs from that event showed an extraordinarily complex arrangement of figures that seemed to represent a kind of master key to the entire communication system. Working with Professor Maxwell and a team of mathematicians from Cambridge University, Margaret began the process of decoding this master arrangement. The work was painstakingly slow, requiring them to correlate the positions of figures with astronomical data, geological surveys, and historical records. After months of analysis, the pattern began to emerge. The arrangement represented a comprehensive map of astronomical knowledge, including predictions of eclipses, planetary movements, and other celestial events, extending thousands of years into the future. But embedded within this astronomical data was something even more extraordinary. "It's a message," Margaret announced during a presentation to the Royal Society in London. The ancient builders used their temporal communication system to leave a message for future generations, for us. The message, when finally decoded, revealed knowledge that seemed impossible for ancient peoples to have possessed. It included accurate descriptions of the solar system, the precession of the equinoxes, and even what appeared to be references to celestial bodies that wouldn't be discovered by modern astronomy for decades. But the most remarkable aspect of the message was its personal nature. The ancient builders seemed to have anticipated that their communication system would eventually be discovered and decoded by future civilizations. They had included what could only be described as greetings and instructions for those who would eventually uncover their temporal technology. "They knew we would find this," Margaret explained to her astonished colleagues. They designed their entire system with the expectation that future generations would develop the technology necessary to decode their messages. They were communicating directly with us across thousands of years. The decoded message also contained warnings about the fragility of their temporal recording system. The ancient builders had known that their technology would eventually degrade, and they had included instructions for preserving and potentially restoring the temporal recording capabilities of the stone circles. "They're asking us to become the guardians of their knowledge," Professor Blackwood observed. "They've passed on the responsibility for maintaining this temporal communication network to future generations." The discovery of the ancient message transformed the entire nature of their investigation. What had begun as an analysis of mysterious photographs had evolved into direct communication with a lost civilization that had possessed technological capabilities far beyond what conventional archaeology had imagined. Margaret found herself at the center of a revolution in historical understanding. The evidence they had gathered suggested that human civilization was far older and more sophisticated than anyone had previously believed. The stone circles represented the remnants of a technological network that had operated for thousands of years, preserving and transmitting knowledge across the century. But the discovery also raised profound questions about the nature of human development and the possibility that advanced civilizations had risen and fallen long before the dawn of recorded history. If the ancient builders possessed such a sophisticated technology, what had happened to their civilization? Why had their knowledge been lost, only to be rediscovered through the accidental investigation of a Victorian photograph? The answers to these questions would require further investigation, but Margaret knew that their discoveries had already fundamentally changed humanity's understanding of its own past. The temporal photographs had revealed not just images of ancient rituals, but evidence of a lost chapter in human history that challenged everything scholars thought they knew about the development of civilization. As she stood once again among the ancient stones of Avebury, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a single mysterious photograph. That image had led them to discoveries that seemed to belong more to the realm of science fiction than historical research. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The ancient builders had left behind more than monuments. They had created a technology that transcended time itself, allowing them to communicate directly with future generations. In decoding their message, Margaret and her colleagues had become part of a conversation that had been continuing for thousands of years, a dialogue between past and future that challenged conventional understanding of time, technology, and human capability. Marked a turning point not just in archaeological understanding, but in humanity's perception of its own history and capabilities. Margaret Whitmore's discoveries at Avebury had sparked a revolution in multiple fields of study, from archaeology and physics to philosophy and theology. The implications of temporal photography and the decoded ancient messages continued to reverberate through academic institutions across Europe and beyond. Margaret established the Institute for Temporal Archaeology at the Royal Archaeological Institute, the world's first research center dedicated to studying the intersection of time, technology, and ancient civilization. The institute attracted scholars from diverse disciplines, all seeking to understand the profound implications of the discoveries that had emerged from a single Victorian photograph. Professor Maxwell had developed increasingly sophisticated theories about the physics underlying temporal recording, publishing papers that would influence scientific thought for decades to come. His work suggested that the ancient builders had understood fundamental principles about the nature of time and electromagnetic radiation that modern science was only beginning to explore. "We are not the first advanced civilization on Earth," Maxwell declared during a landmark lecture at the Royal Society. "The evidence suggests that our ancestors possessed knowledge and capabilities that we are only now beginning to rediscover." The stone circles represent the remnants of a technological network that operated on principles we are still struggling to understand. The decoded messages from the ancient builders had revealed a civilization that existed thousands of years before the conventional dating of human technological development. These people had possessed not only advanced understanding of astronomy and physics, but also a sophisticated grasp of what could only be described as temporal engineering. Margaret's continued research had uncovered evidence that the temporal recording network extended far beyond the British Isles. Working with colleagues across Europe, she had identified similar phenomena at ancient sites in France, Germany, and even as far away as the Mediterranean. The network appeared to have been global in scope, suggesting a level of coordination and communication that challenged conventional understanding of prehistoric human capabilities. The most remarkable discovery came when Margaret's team successfully activated one of the temporal recording devices at Avebury. Using techniques derived from the decoded ancient instructions, they had managed to create new temporal recordings, effectively adding their own messages to the ancient communication net. "We have become part of the system," Margaret explained during a presentation to an international gathering of scholars. "We are no longer just observers of this ancient technology, we are active participants in a communication network that spans millennia." The activation of the temporal recording system had allowed Margaret's team to leave their own messages for future generations, continuing the chain of communication that the ancient builders had established thousands of years earlier. They had encoded information about their discoveries, their understanding of the ancient technology, and instructions for future researchers who might continue their work. But the most profound impact of their discoveries was philosophical rather than technology. The evidence of advanced ancient civilizations had forced humanity to reconsider its place in history and its assumptions about progress and development. "We have been taught to think of human history as a linear progression from primitive to advanced," Margaret wrote in her landmark book, Temporal Archaeology, Messages from the Deep Past. But the evidence suggests that human development has been cyclical, with advanced civilizations rising and falling across vast spans of time. "We are not the pinnacle of human achievement, we are simply the latest chapter in a much longer story." The discovery had also raised questions about the fate of the ancient builders. If they had possessed such advanced technology, what had caused their civilization to disappear? The decoded messages provided some clues, suggesting that the ancient builders had faced some form of catastrophic event that had forced them to preserve their knowledge in the stone circle network before their civilization collapsed. "They knew their time was ending," Margaret explained to her colleagues. The temporal recording network was their attempt to preserve their knowledge for future civilizations. They were essentially creating a time capsule that could only be opened when humanity had developed sufficient technological capability to understand their messages. The implications extended beyond archaeology and history. The discovery of temporal recording technology had opened up new possibilities for scientific research and technological development. If the principles underlying the ancient system could be fully understood and replicated, it might be possible to develop new forms of information storage and communication that transcended conventional limitations of time and space. Research institutions around the world had begun investigating the potential applications of temporal recording technology. The possibilities seemed limitless, from preserving information across geological timescales to developing new forms of communication that could operate across vast distances. But Margaret remained focused on the historical and archaeological implications of their discoveries. She had dedicated her life to understanding the ancient builders and their remarkable civilization, and she knew that there was still much to learn from the temporal recording network they had created. As she approached her 60th birthday, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a single mysterious photograph. That image had led to discoveries that had fundamentally changed humanity's understanding of its own past and opened up possibilities that seemed to belong more to the realm of science fiction than historical research. The ancient builders had succeeded in their goal of preserving their knowledge for future generations. Through their temporal recording network, they had managed to communicate across thousands of years, sharing their understanding of astronomy, physics, and temporal engineering with a civilization that was finally advanced enough to decode their messages. Margaret had become the guardian of this ancient knowledge, responsible for preserving and transmitting it to future generations. She had established protocols for maintaining the temporal recording sites, trained new researchers in the techniques of temporal archaeology, and created institutions that would continue the work long after she was gone. The stone circles of Britain and Europe were no longer seen as mysterious monuments to a forgotten past. They had been revealed as components of a sophisticated technological network created by an advanced, ancient civilization. The temporal photographs that had first revealed their secrets continued to provide new insights into the capabilities and knowledge of the ancient builders. As Margaret stood once again among the ancient stones of Avebury, now equipped with modern monitoring equipment and research facilities, she marveled at the continuity of human curiosity and ingenuity. The ancient builders had looked to the stars and sought to understand the fundamental nature of time and space. Thousands of years later, she and her colleagues were continuing that same quest, building on the foundation of knowledge that had been preserved in stone. The message from the past had been received and decoded. The ancient builders' knowledge lived on, preserved not just in the electromagnetic structure of the stones, but in the minds and institutions of modern researchers who had accepted the responsibility of guardianship. The temporal recording network continued to operate, now under the care of a new generation of guardians who understood both its scientific principles and its profound historical significance. The conversation between past and future that had begun thousands of years ago would continue, ensuring that the knowledge and wisdom of the ancient builders would never again be lost to time. In the end, the discovery of temporal photography at Avebury had revealed more than just images from the past. It had uncovered evidence of humanity's greatest achievement, the ability to transcend time itself through the preservation and transmission of knowledge. The ancient builders had succeeded in their ultimate goal. They had achieved a form of immortality through the eternal preservation of their wisdom in stone and time. This story explores the fascinating possibilities that could emerge from the intersection of Victorian photography, ancient archaeology, and theoretical physics. While the temporal recording technology described is fictional, it draws inspiration from real scientific theories about electromagnetic radiation, crystalline structures, and the nature of time itself. The story serves as a reminder that our understanding of ancient civilizations continues to evolve, and that new technologies and analytical techniques may yet reveal secrets about our past that we can barely imagine today.